On a frozen night in 1942, 200 Allied ships slipped into the Arctic darkness. And for decades, historians asked the same question. How did an entire armada simply vanish? This is the untold story of the convoys the Admiralty feared, the sailors never forgot, and the world tried to bury beneath the ice. This is the night the Arctic swallowed a fleet. The Arctic convoys were the Allies' lifeline to the Soviet Union, a lifeline made of rusted steel, frozen decks, and men who fought not only the enemy, but the sea itself. Temperatures fell to minus 40 degrees. Waves hit with the weight of collapsing buildings. A man who fell overboard lasted less than 90 seconds before the cold seized his lungs. And yet, the convoys sailed every single month. By 1942, more than 200 ships, merchant vessels, destroyers, cruisers, escorts, and handfuls of trawlers and submarines had vanished into storms, pack ice, enemy attack, or simply silence. Some were never found. Some left no survivors. Some disappeared in daylight, as if dragged straight under the waves. But none of those losses compared to what came next. Convoy PQ-17 left Iceland in late June 1942. 35 merchant ships, 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and a handful of trawlers and submarines. Every man aboard knew the truth. This convoy was so important that the Germans would throw everything at it. Waiting for them deep in Norway, the battleship Tirpitz, the most feared surface ship in the world. A single appearance from Tirpitz could kill thousands. But the Arctic had its own plans. By day, the sun never truly set. By night, it never truly rose. A world trapped between light and darkness. Fog rolled across the horizon like a living creature. Icebergs drifted silently, pale, towering, unpredictable. Sailors said they felt watched, not by the Luftwaffe overhead, but by the sea itself. And then came the first disappearance. A ship simply gone. No distress call, no explosion, no debris. One moment, a dot on the horizon. The next, nothing. The Admiralty blamed weather. The escorts blamed ice. The sailors blamed something far worse. Luck. On July 4th, 1942, a message flashed from British command. Cruisers are to withdraw. Convoy is to scatter. The fear? The Tirpitz was moving. A ghost in the fjords. A monster in the mist. The convoy, without protection, was now ordered to split apart. Scattered ships meant less risk of losing everything in one strike. But alone in the Arctic, scattering was a death sentence. The German aircraft and U-boats fell upon them like wolves. What followed was the worst convoy massacre of the entire war. The attacks came in waves. Dive bombers streaked from the clouds, their engines shaking the frozen air. U-boats slipped between drifting ice, launching torpedoes that left no splash, only thunder. Ships burned like floating furnaces. Others broke apart in silence, slipping under the black water. But many simply disappeared. No flame, no sound, no wreckage. Only empty coordinates and the whisper of the wind. Over 200 Allied vessels across 1942, including the ships lost before and after PQ-17, were claimed by the Arctic routes in these same conditions. Storms, submarines, mines, ice, mechanical failure, and sometimes things no one could explain. Bodies were rarely recovered. Steel vanished beneath drifting pack ice. Logbooks froze shut. Families received telegrams with one chilling line: missing, presumed lost. Yet, in the midst of chaos, there were miracles. The Samuel Chase fought through 12 separate attacks and lived. The tanker Alderstel burned for hours, yet stayed afloat long enough for her crew to escape. A tiny escort trawler rammed a German torpedo bomber and survived the explosion. These were ordinary sailors standing against impossible odds. Each man aboard knew that the Arctic was killing them faster than the enemy. Frostbite froze fingers to rifles. Boots froze to steel decks. Breath turned to ice inside their beards. But they did not break. And here lies the cruel twist of fate. The tear pits never attacked. The Admiralty scattered the convoy over a ship that never actually sailed toward them. The convoy died running from a shadow. Out of the 35 merchant ships, only 11 reached Russia. It was the worst convoy disaster in Allied naval history. But it was only one chapter in a much bigger story. The story of the 200 ships the Arctic claimed in 1942 alone. Today, the Arctic keeps its secrets. Many of the ships have never been found. Their hulls lie somewhere in the coldest waters on Earth, under mountains of drifting ice. Their crews rest with them. Young men from Britain, America, Canada, Norway, frozen into history. When explorers finally found some of the wrecks decades later, they described them as time capsules, cabins untouched, boots still by the bunks, instruments intact, as if waiting for the crew to return. But they never would. The Arctic convoys kept the Soviet Union alive. They fed a front that held back millions of German troops. They changed the course of the war. And yet, the cost was almost unbearable. The night those 200 ships vanished is more than a tragedy. It is a reminder that some of the greatest battles of World War II were fought in silence, in darkness, in places where no enemy was needed, because the sea itself was deadly enough. To the sailors who froze on the decks, to the gunners who stood their posts in blinding snow, to the captains who guided their ships through storms that swallowed fleets. This story is yours, and tonight we remember you. They came out of the darkness, 4 men stepping onto an American beach in the dead of night. No uniforms, no flags, no mercy. Just explosives, disguises, and a mission that, if successful, would change the course of World War II forever. This is the real story of the Nazi saboteurs who infiltrated the United States, the mission that panicked Washington, and the betrayal from within that brought it all crashing down. June 13th, 1942. The Atlantic is a black sheet of water as the German submarine U-202 rises near the shores of Long Island. 4 men climb into a rubber boat and quietly row toward the empty coastline. Their leader is George Dasch, a German-American who once lived in New York. Behind him are Ernst Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin, trained saboteurs of Hitler's Abwehr. They carry crates of explosives disguised as coal, timers, detonators, acid vials for suicide. Their objective is simple and devastating: cripple America's war machine before it can fully awaken. The men step onto the sand and begin burying their equipment. And then, unexpected footsteps. A U.S. Coast Guardsman is approaching. Seaman John Cullen, walking his midnight patrol, spots silhouettes moving ahead. He calls out. The saboteurs freeze. Dasch steps forward, threatening Cullen, then switches tactics. He bribes him with a handful of cash, telling him to forget what he saw. Cullen backs away, terrified, but alive. At sunrise, the FBI is already investigating. A suspicious encounter, fresh footprints, German debris found in the dunes. But the saboteurs are already gone, blending into New York City by train. And hundreds of miles away, another threat is on the horizon. 4 days later, another German submarine, U-584, surfaces off the coast of Florida. 4 more saboteurs land: Edward Curling, Hermann Neubauer, Werner Thiel, and Herbert Haupt. Their targets include critical infrastructure: bridges, water plants, aluminum factories, anything that keeps American industry alive. If they succeed, they could delay U.S. war production by years. But the entire mission is already on borrowed time, because the leader of the Long Island group is wrestling with a secret no one expected. George Dasch was never fully committed to Hitler's cause. He'd lived in America. He spoke the language. He felt more at home in New York than in Berlin. And what he witnessed in Nazi Germany filled him with disgust. So instead of carrying out the operation, he decides to betray it. He walks straight into the FBI office in Washington, D.C., asks to speak to someone in authority, and calmly reveals everything: the landings, the explosives, the code words, the names. Agents laugh at him until he empties $84,000 of German sabotage funds on the desk. The room goes silent. Within hours, the FBI launches one of the fastest manhunts in American history. They locate the Florida team. They arrest the remaining saboteurs in New York City, 8 men in total, captured before the first bomb is ever planted. A mission that was supposed to terrorize America becomes one of the greatest intelligence failures of Nazi Germany. President Franklin Roosevelt demands swift justice. A secret military tribunal is assembled, fast, unforgiving, and final. The verdict: 6 of the saboteurs are sentenced to death, executed on August 8, 1942. Only 2 are spared: George Dasch and Ernst Berger, both of whom cooperated with investigators. Dasch receives 30 years. Berger is given life. But after the war, both sentences are commuted. The men are deported to Germany, where they are shunned as traitors by both nations. Operation Pastorius was supposed to cripple America's industrial backbone. Instead, it exposed vulnerabilities along the coastline, forced rapid improvements in homeland security, and strengthened public resolve. It also revealed something deeper. Even the most carefully trained saboteurs can crumble under doubt, fear, and fractured loyalty. Had Dash remained loyal, had Colin reacted differently, had the teams carried out their mission, the early years of America's war effort might have unfolded very differently. Operation Pastorius wasn't just a failed mission. It was proof that even the most dangerous threats can collapse from within. And somewhere beneath the sand of Amagansett Beach, the traces of that night still remain, silent evidence of the moment Nazi Germany tried to strike American soil and failed.
Imagine a submarine so mysterious that it simply refused to die. A vessel that vanished not once, not twice, but 3 times during World War II, leaving Allied intelligence frozen in confusion. This is the story of U-1214, the German U-boat whose final fate remains one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances of the war. When U-1214 left the docks at Kiel in late 1943, it was praised as one of Germany's most advanced coastal submarines. But from the very beginning, something felt wrong. The captain wrote in his log, "The boat behaves differently, almost as if the sea itself rejects her." The crew laughed at first. Within a week, no one was laughing. January 1944. U-1214 was patrolling the icy waters north of Scotland when it suddenly dropped off all radio communication. For 9 days, German command believed the submarine had sunk. No survivors, no wreckage, no distress signal. But then it returned, damaged, leaking, yet somehow still afloat. The crew refused to explain what happened. One sailor only whispered, "The ocean took us and then gave us back." It was officially recorded as the first disappearance. Despite the strange incident, Berlin forced U-1214 back into service. Its mission: gather intelligence deep within heavily guarded British waters. But the submarine never reached its patrol zone. In thick fog, U-1214 surfaced violently. Nearby fishermen reported men shouting, metal grinding, a deep rumbling beneath the water. Then silence. Allied aircraft searched the area. Nothing. U-1214 had disappeared again. 3 weeks later, it returned, but half the crew was missing. The captain was hospitalized. His final statement was, "There is something under the water. It follows us, and it decides who comes back." April 1944. A new captain, a new crew. Strict orders: do not engage the enemy. Do not dive below 120 meters. Maintain constant radio reports. U-1214 ignored all of them. On the second day of patrol, it descended to 180 meters, far below safety limits. Engineers swore they heard knocking on the hull. At 3:17, a radio message broke through. "Being shallowed, cannot identify, moving beneath us." Seconds later, another transmission. "If anyone receives this, turn back. It's not." Transmission lost. No signal ever came again.
When the war ended, U-1214 remained one of the few U-boats with no confirmed wreck anywhere in the North Sea. But the story didn't die in 1945. In 1958, 13 years after its disappearance, a British trawler spotted a gray submarine hull drifting near the Norwegian coast. They saw numbers, barely visible under rust. 121-4. When naval inspectors arrived, the object was gone. No submarine has ever been officially recovered there. Experts have debated the mystery for decades. Mechanical failure? Possibly, but it doesn't explain the disappearances and returns. Navigation mistakes? Unlikely. Two crews experienced the same events. Captured secretly by the Allies? No records support this. Deep water pressure phenomenon. Some believe U-1214 encountered rare underwater forces that could pull vessels into the deep and then release them again. Crew psychological collapse? Maybe, but why twice with two different crews? Until a wreck is found, everything remains speculation. All we know is this. U-1214 vanished 3 times. 2 crews returned. 1 did not. Somewhere beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, the final resting place of the submarine still waits to be found. A steel ghost of a war long gone, carrying secrets no one has ever uncovered.
In the early months of the Pacific War, Japan's admirals believed they controlled the sea. Their carriers were undefeated. Their battleships still gleamed with confidence, and their submarines patrolled the ocean like silent hunters. But beneath that confidence, a single event was waiting. One moment, one strike, one submarine attack that would shatter Japan's illusion of dominance and change the course of the entire war. It began on May 7th, 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy was sweeping south toward Australia, preparing to crush Allied resistance in the Coral Sea. Japanese commanders believed the American fleet was too slow, too scattered, too afraid to challenge their advance. They were wrong, because at that very moment, an American submarine was stalking them from below. The submarine was USS Growler, a vessel still fresh to war, commanded by a young and aggressive captain, Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore. Gilmore understood the risk. Approaching a Japanese task force meant entering a death zone of destroyers, sonar sweeps, and depth charges. But he also understood something else. If he could strike the right ship at the right moment, he could break the entire Japanese operation. Before dawn, Growler sighted shadows on the horizon. 4 Japanese destroyers were escorting a carrier group, the spearhead of Japan's advance. They moved fast, confident, unaware that an American submarine had slipped beneath their formation. Gilmore watched through the periscope. One destroyer, then another, then the prize, a massive Japanese escort carrier, Shoho, at the center of the formation. To sink a carrier this early in the war would send shockwaves across Japan's command. Gilmore made his decision. Growler crept closer, silent, patient. The crew waited in absolute stillness as the carrier crossed the submarine's sights. Gilmore whispered the order. Fire. 4 torpedoes roared from Growler's tubes. The Japanese destroyers reacted instantly. Spotlights, alarms, engines screaming.
But it was too late. Two torpedoes slammed into the carrier with explosive force. Flames erupted across the flight deck. Smoke poured into the sky. Within minutes, the ship began to list. The Japanese admiral in command, Takeo Tagaki, could barely grasp what he was seeing. A single American submarine, alone, had ripped open the heart of his task force. The carrier's aircraft, vital for scouting and defense, were gone. Communications were chaotic. And worse, no one knew how many submarines might be lurking beneath them. Panic spread through the Japanese command. If the Americans had finally mastered submarine warfare, then Japan's supply lines, invasions, and carriers were all suddenly vulnerable. The confidence that had defined the early Pacific War cracked. The destroyers launched a furious cover attack. Depth charges shook the ocean. Water hammered the hull of the Growler. The submarine dove deeper, deeper still, as explosions rolled above them like underwater thunder. But Gilmore held his nerve. He escaped into the blackness of the sea. What the Japanese admirals did next revealed their fear. They halted their advance. They changed their operational plans. And in Tokyo, naval strategists began fiercely debating how to counter a threat they believed they would not face until years later. The attack by USS Growler had exposed the truth that Japan's naval dominance was not invincible. Their formations were not untouchable, and American submarines, once seen as weak and unreliable, now posed a lethal threat. In the weeks that followed, this single submarine attack set off a chain reaction. More U.S. submarines pressed forward. More Japanese ships were lost. Convoys tightened. Fuel shortages worsened. And by 1933, Japanese commanders admitted privately that submarines had become the most dangerous enemy they faced. Japan's admirals had panicked on that May morning, and for good reason. The attack marked the beginning of a transformation in the Pacific War, a shift from Japanese dominance to American pressure to ultimate American control of the seas. And it all began with one submarine, one captain, and one strike that changed everything.
In the cold, dark waters of northern Norway, a single battleship held the entire Royal Navy in fear. Her name was Tirpitz, sister ship of the Bismarck, armored like a floating fortress, armed with guns that could crush a cruiser in a single blow. To Churchill, she was the Beast. And as long as she lived, the Arctic convoys to Russia could never be safe. But the British had a plan, not with battleships, not with aircraft, but with 6 tiny submarines, each no longer than a bus, and powered by only 4 men inside. They were called X-Craft. Their mission? Penetrate the fjord, evade nets, mines, patrol boats, and tidal currents, sneak beneath the Tirpitz, and plant explosive charges powerful enough to rip open her armored hull. It was a mission so dangerous, commanders described it simply as a suicide operation with a small chance of survival. In early September 1943, the X-Craft were towed across the North Sea by larger submarines. The weather was brutal. Salt spray froze on deck. Inside the craft, the air grew thin, damp, and foul. The crews operated in 40 degrees Fahrenheit, surrounded by batteries that could leak acid and engines that filled the tiny hull with choking fumes. One commander wrote, "It was like living inside a steel coffin, one that creaked with every wave." Still, they pressed on. On the night of September 21st, 1943, the X-Craft slipped their tow lines and headed alone toward Kafjord, where the Tirpitz waited. 2 craft were lost almost immediately. One struck a mine. Another was trapped in anti-submarine nets. The crews were captured, but not before destroying their equipment. The remaining 2, X6 and X7, continued forward. They moved slowly, silently. Every turn of the propeller measured, every sound a threat. Above them, German patrol boats circled. Searchlights swept the surface. Hydrophones probed the depths. One wrong move, and the mission was over. Just after dawn, X6 reached the Tirpitz anchorage. Visibility was almost zero. The water was thick with silt and debris. The commander peered through the periscope and saw the dark shape of the battleship looming above him. They were directly beneath the largest German warship ever built. Working quickly, the crew released their side charges, each packed with 2 tons of high explosive. Moments later, X7 did the same. Both crews attempted to escape, but the fjord was filled with nets. X6 was trapped. X7 became entangled and sank. Some men were rescued. Others were not. But the charges were in place. At 8:12 a.m., the water in the fjord shook like thunder. A massive blast lifted the Tirpitz out of the sea. Bulkheads crumpled, engines tore loose, the stern twisted, flooding spread through multiple compartments. Several gun turrets were knocked out of action. It was as if the ship had been hit by an underwater earthquake. The German commander later wrote, "The ship convulsed. Men were thrown to the floor. I believed for a moment that we were breaking in half." The Tirpitz did not sink that day, but she was crippled, completely immobilized. It took 6 months for Germany to attempt repairs. Even then, the ship was never the same. The X-craft mission, Operation Source, had succeeded beyond expectation. 4 men received the Victoria Cross. 9 others received high honors. Every sailor involved had risked everything. Tiny submarines, crewed by volunteers, did what the Royal Navy's battleships could not. They had broken the back of Hitler's last great sea weapon. Operation Source proved that courage, skill, and innovation could defeat even the largest war machine. It was a turning point in the Arctic War, and it ensured that the Tirpitz, Churchill's beast, would never again threaten the Allied convoys. From the frozen fjords to the silent depths, the story of the X-craft remains one of the most daring naval attacks in history. A reminder that sometimes the smallest vessels carry the greatest bravery. By April 1945, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard. For 6 years, the German U-boat force had been the ultimate predator. They had sunk battleships. They had strangled supply lines. They were the Gray Wolves. But there is one loss in the German naval archives that doesn't fit the legend. U-1206, a cutting-edge Type 7C submarine. It wasn't destroyed by a British destroyer. It wasn't bombed by an American aircraft. It didn't hit a mine. On April 14, 1945, just weeks before the war ended, this advanced warship was sent to the bottom of the ocean by a plumber. Actually, it was worse than that. The captain of U-1206 didn't just lose his ship. He became the only commander in history to sink his own submarine by using the toilet. This is the story of the most embarrassing disaster of World War II. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the desperation of the German Navy in 1945. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt was 27 years old. He was commanding U-1206 on its very first combat patrol. His mission was suicide. Take his boat right up to the coast of Scotland and hunt Allied convoys. But there was a problem.
Allied radar was everywhere. If a U-boat surfaced to recharge its batteries or get fresh air, it was dead. The British would spot them in seconds. This meant U-boats had to stay submerged for days at a time. They had to live, eat, sleep, and use the facilities hundreds of feet underwater. And this is where the engineering gets tricky. On older submarines, the toilets, or heads, worked simply. They flushed waste directly into the ocean. But that only worked near the surface. Once you dive deep, the water pressure outside the hull is massive. If you tried to flush a standard toilet at 200 feet, the ocean would just blast the waste right back into the submarine. So usually, the crew had to store their waste in buckets until they could surface. It smelled terrible. It was unsanitary. It was miserable. But U-1206 was different. It had a secret weapon. German engineers had installed a brand new invention, the deep-water, high-pressure toilet. This system was a marvel of over-engineering. It didn't just flush. It used a series of airlocks and compressed air to force waste out of the boat, pushing it against the crushing pressure of the deep Atlantic. It sounds brilliant, but there was a catch. It was wildly complicated. Operating this toilet wasn't just a matter of pulling a handle. It required a specific sequence of opening and closing valves. First, you open the chamber. Then you close the intake. Then you pressurize the airlock. Then you open the outer valve. If you did it in the wrong order, disaster. The system was so complex that U-1206 actually had a specialist on board. One sailor was trained specifically to serve as the toilet waste disposal unit manager. Think about that. In the middle of a war, one man's job was to make sure nobody flushed the wrong way. But on April 14th, the captain decided he didn't need help. This is where history gets a little murky, but the result is indisputable. Between the captain and the engineer, a mistake was made. The wrong valve was opened while the outer hatch was arguably still unsealed. They didn't just open a pipe, they opened a hole directly to the Atlantic Ocean. A high-pressure jet of seawater blasted into the submarine. It was uncontrollable. The water pressure at that depth is roughly 90 pounds of pressure per square inch. You cannot stop it with your hands. But the water wasn't the only problem. The toilet was located directly above the submarine's massive battery banks. When seawater mixes with battery acid, it creates an immediate chemical reaction. It produces chlorine gas. Within seconds, the forward compartment wasn't just flooding, it was filling with a deadly yellow-green poison. The crew began to choke, their eyes burned, their lungs seized up. Captain Schlitt had no choice. If they stayed down, the gas would kill everyone in minutes. He gave the order, "Blow the tanks, surface, surface." The U-1206 shot to the surface like a cork. The crew scrambled out of the hatches, coughing and gasping for air, desperate to get away from the chlorine gas. But their luck had run out. They had surfaced right under the nose of the British patrols they were hiding from. Almost immediately, they were spotted. British aircraft swept in and began strafing the helpless submarine. Captain Schlitt realized the boat was lost. The chlorine gas was too thick to go back down, and the British were closing in. He ordered the crew to abandon ship and scuttle the vessel. They opened the main valves, and U-1206, the pride of the German fleet, slipped beneath the waves for the last time. Tragically, it wasn't a bloodless mistake. 4 men died during the evacuation, either from the chlorine gas or the rough seas. 46 others, including the captain, were captured and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt lived till 2009. For decades, he denied that he was the one who turned the wrong valve, blaming the engineer. But the nickname followed him forever. In the brutal history of naval warfare, thousands of ships have been lost to torpedoes, mines, and storms, but only one was defeated by its own plumbing. If you enjoyed this story of engineering gone wrong, make sure to hit that subscribe button. we are digging up the most shocking command decisions of World War II every single week. This is the Command History. We'll see you on the next patrol.
The USS O'Bannon was one of the deadliest ships in the U.S. Navy. She carried 5-inch guns, depth charges, and torpedoes. But on a dark night in the Pacific, her survival didn't depend on high explosives. It depended on a vegetable. How does a crew of terrifyingly well-armed American sailors end up fighting a Japanese submarine with potatoes? Today, we are inside the strangest, most desperate close-quarters battle of World War II. It is the spring of 1943, the Solomon Islands. The waters here are dangerous. They call this area Iron Bottom Sound because of the sheer number of ships sunk beneath the waves. The USS O'Bannon is patrolling the darkness. The crew is on edge. They have been fighting for months. They're tired, they're jumpy, and they know the Japanese Navy is hunting them. Suddenly, a blip on the radar. A Japanese submarine, the RO-34, has just surfaced to recharge its batteries. It is completely unaware that an American destroyer is barreling toward it at high speed. The American captain, Donald McDonald, makes a split-second decision. He orders the ship to ram. He wants to slice the submarine in half before it can dive. The O'Bannon accelerates. The steel prow looms over the tiny submarine. Impact is imminent. But at the very last second, the captain freezes. He realizes this might be a mine-laying submarine. If he rams it, the explosion could destroy his own ship. He shouts, "Hard rudder left!" The O'Bannon swerves, but physics is a cruel mistress. The momentum carries the destroyer right alongside the submarine. They aren't colliding, they are drifting parallel to each other. They are so close, the hulls are almost scraping paint, and this creates a deadly problem. The O'Bannon's massive guns are designed to shoot at targets miles away. They cannot depress low enough to hit a submarine that is sitting 10 feet away. The Americans are effectively disarmed, but the Japanese are not. The hatch of the submarine flies open. Japanese sailors scramble onto the wet deck. They run toward their 3-inch deck gun. If they can load that gun, they will blast a hole right into the O'Bannon's hull at point-blank range. The American sailors on the deck look around wildly. They don't have rifles, they don't have grenades. They are standing on the deck of a warship, completely defenseless. Nearby, there are deck storage lockers. The sailors rip them open, looking for anything to throw. They find potatoes, crates of them. It sounds ridiculous, but in the dark, in the chaos of war, fear plays tricks on the mind. The Americans start hurling the potatoes at the submarine with everything they've got. To the Japanese sailors below, it is pitch black. Suddenly, round, heavy objects are raining down on them, clanging against the metal hull, bouncing off the deck gun. The Japanese commander panics. He thinks these are hand grenades. Instead of manning their gun, the Japanese crew is paralyzed. They are too busy picking up the potatoes and throwing them into the ocean, trying to get rid of the explosives before they detonate. That moment of confusion buys the Americans the time they need. While the submarine crew is fighting off the vegetable assault, the O'Bannon finally uses its engines to pull away. The distance opens up, 100 yards, 200 yards. Now the guns have the angle. Captain McDonald gives the order. A shell tears through the RO-34's conning tower. The submarine shudders and begins to sink stern first. The O'Bannon circles back, dropping depth charges to make sure the job is done. The RO-34 and her crew are gone, sunk by a destroyer and a locker full of starch. When the story reached the mainland, it became a sensation. The Maine Potato Growers Association even sent a plaque to the ship to commemorate the victory. Historians still argue about the details. Some say it was just empty shell casings they threw, but the legend of the Spud sub stuck.
The USS O'Bannon would go on to earn 17 battle stars, becoming the most decorated destroyer of the Pacific War. She survived planes, torpedoes, and battleships, but she will always be remembered for the night she fought.
It is the most successful submarine in the United States Navy, a predator that has single-handedly destroyed entire enemy convoys. It is the apex predator of the Pacific. But on a dark night in October, this legendary hunter didn't die in a battle with a destroyer. It wasn't crushed by depth charges. It wasn't bombed by a Zero. The deadliest ship in the fleet was killed by its own weapon. How does a single mechanical error doom 87 men in just 20 seconds? This is the story of the USS Tang and the cruelest twist of irony in World War II. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the arrogance, and the Tang had earned the right to be arrogant. By 1944, the Tang was a ghost story whispered among Japanese sailors. Her captain, Richard O'Kane, didn't fight like a submarine commander. He fought like a sniper. Most captains fired from deep underwater using sonar, not O'Kane. He preferred to surface the boat at night, right in the middle of enemy convoys. He would run on the surface, engines screaming, dodging between Japanese transport ships, firing torpedoes point blank. It was reckless, it was insane, and it was incredibly effective. On her final patrol in the Formosa Strait, O'Kane turned the ocean into a graveyard. In a single night, he sank 5 ships. At one point, he was maneuvering so aggressively that a Japanese transport tried to ram him. He cleared the enemy bow by inches, firing torpedoes as he sped away. By the night of October 24th, the Tang was low on ammo. They had fired almost everything they had. They should have gone home. They had sunk enough ships to make history. But O'Kane saw one last target, a crippled transport ship. He looked at the torpedo tally. They had 2 torpedoes left, just 2. O'Kane decided to finish the job. It is 2:30 in the morning. The Tang creeps up on the crippled enemy. O'Kane orders the second-to-last torpedo fired. It runs true. It slams into the transport. 1 torpedo left, the 24th, the last shot of the patrol. O'Kane lines up the shot to put the enemy out of its misery. He yells the command, "Fire!" The final torpedo, a Mark 18 electric, shoots out of the tube. On the bridge, O'Kane watches the phosphorescent wake. It should go straight. It doesn't. Immediately after leaving the tube, the torpedo breaches the surface. It porpoises, jumping out of the water like a dolphin. Then it turns hard to the left. On the bridge, a lookout screams, "Torpedo erratic!" O'Kane shouts, "All ahead emergency, right full rudder." He's trying to turn the sub out of the way. He's trying to outrun his own bullet. But the torpedo completes a tight, perfect 180-degree circle. It's not hunting the enemy anymore. It's hunting the Tang. It takes roughly 20 seconds. The men on the bridge watch the white wake curve through the black water, coming straight back at them. There is nothing they can do. The torpedo strikes the stern of the Tang. This wasn't a dud. This was a warhead designed to break the keel of a battleship. The explosion is violent. The stern of the submarine is instantly vaporized. The Tang sinks in seconds. O'Kane and 8 others on the bridge are thrown into the water. They're the lucky ones. But for the men trapped inside the submarine, the nightmare is just beginning. The Tang slams into the bottom of the ocean, 180 feet down. Half the crew is dead from the explosion. But in the forward torpedo room, about 30 men are still alive. They're trapped in a steel tube in total darkness. The heat is rising because the batteries are on fire. The air is filling with smoke. They have one way out, the Momsen lung. This was a primitive rebreather device. To use it, you had to flood the compartment you were standing in. You have to let the freezing ocean water come up to your neck to equalize the pressure. Then you open the escape hatch and swim up 180 feet without your lungs exploding.
Imagine the psychological horror. You are sitting in the dark. The water is rising around your chest. You can hear the hull groaning, and you know that if you open that hatch, you might drown instantly. 13 men tried to make the escape. Only 5 made it to the surface. On the surface, it was morning. Captain O'Kane was treading water, wounded. Pop, pop, pop. 5 heads bobbed up from the depths, the survivors from the forward room. Out of a crew of 87 men, only 9 survived. And here is the final insult. A Japanese frigate, one of the ships the Tang was hunting, spotted the survivors. They pulled O'Kane and his men out of the water. They beat them mercilessly. The survivors of the greatest submarine in history spent the rest of the war in a brutal prison camp. The USS Tang is officially credited with sinking 24 Japanese ships, the second highest total of the war. But stats don't tell the story. The Tang was a perfect weapon. It was too fast, too aggressive, and too deadly for the Japanese Navy to catch. In the end, the only thing capable of sinking the Tang was the Tang. Did you know the Tang was killed by a malfunctioning Mark 18 torpedo? But did you know this wasn't the only time U.S. torpedoes failed? In fact, early in the war, U.S. torpedoes would often bounce off enemy ships without exploding. If you want to know how a scandalous government cover-up sent U.S. sailors into battle with dud weapons, click this video right here. You won't believe how long they kept the secret.
They were the most ambitious submarines ever built. Monsters of steel so vast they could carry airplanes within their hulls. Japan called them the I-400 class. The Allies would later call them something else entirely: underwater aircraft carriers. At the height of World War II, Japan's empire was collapsing. The Pacific was no longer theirs. But deep within hidden shipyards, far from American bombers, a new kind of weapon was taking shape. One that could change the course of the war with a single strike. Each I-400 submarine was longer than a football field, twice the size of any sub in the world. They could travel around the entire planet without surfacing. Inside, they carry 3 foldable attack planes, sealed in a watertight hangar, ready to launch from a catapult the moment the sub broke the surface. The mission? Strike America directly. Japan's high command dreamed of launching a surprise attack on the U.S. mainland, targets like the Panama Canal or even San Francisco. If they could destroy the canal, they could block America's fleet from reaching the Pacific. If they could strike the West Coast, they could bring the war to American soil for the first time. But these were desperate dreams, burned from a crumbling empire. By 1944, Japan had lost nearly all its carriers. Its air force was shattered. Yet the submarine program continued, driven by secrecy, obsession, and hope for one last miracle. When the first I-400 finally sailed, it was unlike anything the world had seen. It carried 150 men, massive fuel reserves, torpedoes, and even living quarters for pilots. The crew called it a floating city beneath the sea. Its aircraft, the HE-M6A Saron, was a marvel of engineering. An attack plane designed to fold its wings and tail to fit into a narrow tube, then unfold in seconds on deck, ready to fly. Each could carry a bomb strong enough to sink a battleship or devastate a harbor. In the summer of 1945, with Japan's situation hopeless, the fleet received its first and only real mission. 2 I-400s and 1 smaller sister sub would sail across the Pacific to attack the American fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, home to hundreds of Allied ships. The plan was audacious. Launch the planes at dawn, strike the harbor, and vanish beneath the waves before anyone knew what hit them. The submarines set sail. But fate would not let them finish their journey. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across the radio waves. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The crews were stunned. Some wept in silence. Others refused to believe it. The great submarines that had carried Japan's final hope would never fire a shot. To prevent the technology from falling into Soviet hands, the U.S. Navy ordered them sunk. Within weeks, the once secret I-400 fleet, Japan's giants of the deep, was scuttled off the coast of Hawaii, swallowed by the sea they were meant to dominate. For decades, their story remained hidden, classified, forgotten, buried in silence, until divers rediscovered their rusted hulls lying in the darkness, still intact, still haunting. When light first touched their remains, it was as if time itself paused, revealing the shadow of a war that nearly reached the American shore. The I-400s were not just weapons, they were symbols of a nation's desperation, of genius turned to ruin, and of how far humanity will go when cornered by defeat. In the end, they never launched their planes, never fired their torpedoes, and never changed the outcome of the war. But their existence proved something extraordinary, that even in the final hours of a dying empire, Japan's engineers dreamed of the impossible. Beneath the waves, those dreams still rest, silent, enormous, and waiting.
In May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and the world celebrated the end of the war, one German submarine quietly raised a white flag. Its captain signaled surrender, and the crew laid down their arms. But within days, that same submarine vanished. No trace, no wreckage. Just a chilling mystery that has haunted historians for decades. This is the true story of the U-boat that disappeared after surrendering. The submarine was U-530, a Type 9C U-boat, one of the longest-range vessels in Hitler's navy. In early 1945, as Germany's defeat became inevitable, U-530 was stationed in the North Atlantic, far from home, far from command. Her captain, Otto Wermuth, received fragmented orders. Some said return to base, others continue the patrol. But in the confusion of Germany's final days, Wermuth made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of surrendering to the Allies in Europe, U-530 sailed west. For more than 2 months, she disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves. No radio contact, no sightings, nothing. When the submarine finally surfaced again, it was July 10, 1945. The war was long over. The crew raised a white flag and surrendered in Argentina.
Good God, look!
Thousands of miles from home, a German U-boat appeared off the coast of Mar del Plata. Argentine sailors watched in shock as the black submarine approached slowly, her deck empty, crew standing stiffly in formation. When questioned, the men gave no clear answers. Why had they sailed all this way? Why surrender months after the war had ended? And most importantly, what happened during those missing weeks? The Argentine Navy immediately detained the crew and began interrogations. They found no weapons on board, no documents, and strangely, no logs from their final voyage. Captain Wermuth claimed they had destroyed all records before surrendering to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. He insisted they had no special mission, no secret passengers, just fear of capture and confusion in the final chaos of the war. But that explanation didn't convince everyone. Because 2 months later, Another U-boat arrived in Argentina, U-977. Its story was eerily similar. It too had fled Europe after Germany's surrender, and it too arrived without logs or explanation. By then, the rumors were impossible to stop. Some believed these submarines were part of a secret Nazi evacuation, that high-ranking officers or even Hitler himself had escaped on board. Others claimed the U-boats carried gold, documents, or advanced technology bound for hidden bases in South America. Argentina's government, known for its post-war ties with former Nazis, offered no clear answers. And the Allies? They launched their own secret investigations, fearing what these mysterious voyages might mean. Declassified U.S. Navy files show that Operation Cabal and Project Paperclip teams were ordered to track down every missing German U-boat. Many wrecks were found, but U-530's story remained suspiciously thin. Its voyage logs vanished, its cargo records were missing, and some reports suggested that several crew members were never accounted for. So, what really happened? Most historians today believe U-530 simply fled in fear. Her captain may have been terrified of Soviet capture or wanted to ensure his men's survival. When they realized there was no future in hiding, they surfaced and surrendered. But others aren't so sure. The Argentine Navy noted unexplained weight changes in the sub, as if something heavy had been unloaded before surrender. Local fishermen told stories of mysterious lights near the coast days before U-530 arrived. And in the years that followed, dozens of Nazi fugitives did surface in Argentina, living quiet lives under false names. Whether U-530 carried secrets or simply ghosts of a dying empire, it remains one of the most haunting mysteries of World War II. A submarine that surrendered, then vanished into history, leaving behind only questions. Because sometimes the war didn't end in May 1945. For some men, it never truly ended at all.
Imagine this. You command one of the most feared weapons of World War II. You're a decorated hero of the Third Reich, sinking Allied ships with ruthless efficiency. Your name strikes terror into the hearts of sailors across the Atlantic. But then the war ends. What happens to a man who lived such a life? Does he fade into obscurity, face justice, or does he rise again, even wearing the uniform of a new Germany, and serve the very alliance he once fought against? The Battle of the Atlantic was World War II's longest and deadliest campaign. At its heart were Germany's U-boats, a silent, deadly force that pushed the Allies to the brink. These were the Hunters, commanded by men like Otto Kretschmer, the Silent Otto, or Erich Topp, the Red Devil. They were young, highly skilled, and utterly dedicated to their mission. For years, they were the scourge of the seas, a potent symbol of German power. But the tide turned. Allied technology, tactics, and sheer industrial might began to overwhelm the U-boat force. What started as a daring offensive became a desperate struggle for survival. Of the 40,000 men who served in U-boats, a staggering 30,000 never came home. This was a war of attrition, and for those who survived, the end of the conflict brought a new, uncertain reality. For many commanders, the immediate aftermath meant capture. Men like Otto Kretschmer, the top-scoring U-boat ace, spent years in Allied POW camps. This was a jarring transition from the claustrophobic intensity of a U-boat to the relative monotony of captivity. These camps became a liminal space, where former enemies guarded each other. They were forced to process the trauma of war and perhaps contemplate their future in a world utterly transformed. For other commanders, recommentation returned to a Germany shattered by war.
They had to rebuild not just their country, but their own lives. Some, like Reinhard Hartigan, known for his audacious attacks off the American coast, channeled their wartime discipline and strategic thinking into business. Hartigan became a successful oil executive, a far cry from stalking convoys in the Atlantic. These men often carried their wartime experiences silently. They integrated back into a society desperate for stability and reconstruction. But then came perhaps the most surprising twist: the recreation of a German navy in the mid-1950s, the Bundesmarine, as part of NATO. And who better to lead this new force than experienced, albeit controversial, naval officers? Men like Otto Kretschmer, the former U-boat ace, returned to service. He rose through the ranks to become a flotilla admiral, even serving as chief of staff for the NATO Command Baltic approaches. Can you imagine the irony? A man who once tried to starve Britain into submission, now helping defend the West against a new threat. Eric Topp, another decorated U-boat commander, also rejoined the Bundesmarine, ultimately becoming an inspector. Ernst Rauer, commander of U-120, served for nearly 20 years in the post-war German Navy. Their rehabilitation, and indeed their re-employment, was a pragmatic decision in a Cold War world, but also a profound statement on forgiveness and the need to move forward. However, not all stories ended in rehabilitation or quiet retirement. The shadow of war crimes loomed large for some. Admiral Karl Donitz, the Grand Admiral of the U-boat fleet and Hitler's designated successor, was tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted not for direct atrocities, but for waging unrestricted submarine warfare, a controversial charge, and for crimes against peace. He served 10 years in Spandau prison. And then there were direct acts of brutality. Commander Heinz Wilhelm Eck of U-852 faced a far harsher fate. After sinking a Greek freighter, he ordered his men to machine gun the survivors in the water to destroy evidence. He and several of his crew were tried and executed for their actions, a stark reminder that even in the chaos of war, individual accountability for horrific crimes existed. The stories of Germany's U-boat commanders after World War II are not simple tales of heroes or villains. They are complex narratives of survival, adaptation, justice, and astonishing rehabilitation. From the depths of the Atlantic to the halls of NATO, their journeys reflect the turbulent, often contradictory process of a nation grappling with its past and forging a new identity. Their lives remind us that history is rarely black and white, but a spectrum of human choices and consequences. What do you think about the fates of these commanders? Were their post-war roles justified? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this dive into history fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more untold stories, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. In the dying days of World War II, Allied sailors began to hear rumors. Whispers of a German submarine, unlike anything the oceans had ever seen. A vessel so advanced it could stay submerged for weeks, silent, invisible, unstoppable. They called it the Type 21, the world's first true super submarine. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned against Germany. Convoys were protected by radar, sonar, and hunter-killer groups. U-boats that once ruled the seas were now hunted, destroyed before they could strike. But deep beneath bombed cities and collapsing factories, Nazi engineers worked on something revolutionary. They called it Electroboat, a submarine powered almost entirely underwater, capable of moving faster below the surface than on it. Traditional U-boats could dive for only a few hours, their batteries drained quickly. But this monster could remain submerged for more than 10 days, traveling nearly 400 nautical miles underwater. To Allied intelligence, The first reports sounded impossible. A submarine that didn't need to surface to recharge? That could outrun destroyers underwater? That had a sleek, hydrodynamic hull, shaped not like a ship, but a bullet of steel. Yet, in secret pens along Germany's northern coast, the Type 21 was real. It carried 6 bow torpedo tubes, each preloaded and ready to fire in seconds. Its periscopes were streamlined, its sonar the most advanced of its age. Even its electric motors were near silent, whispering through the depths like ghosts. For Allied commanders, this changed everything. If hundreds of these super subs had entered service in time, the Atlantic supply lines, Britain's lifeline, might have been severed once again. Victory itself could have been delayed by years. But time was one resource Germany no longer had. Bombings, shortages, and chaos crippled production. Of 118 Type 21 submarines built, only 2 ever saw combat patrols. Too late to alter history. When Allied troops captured the shipyards, what they found shocked them. Dozens of unfinished hulls, factories filled with broken molds and shattered machinery, and blueprints. Technology so advanced, it looked decades ahead of its time.
Test appears successful.
The British, Americans, and Soviets all wanted the same thing: those submarines. Captured Type 21s were studied in silence. One was sent to the United States and became the USS Sea Lion. Another went to the Soviets, inspiring the feared Whiskey class of the Cold War. Even the Royal Navy used one as a test platform for years. In a twist of history, Germany's lost weapon became the blueprint for modern submarines. The sonar domes, hull shape, battery systems, even the concept of silent cruising all came directly from the Type 21. Their creators believed they were saving the Reich. Instead, they changed naval warfare forever. The world beneath the waves would never be the same again. Today, only fragments remain, rusted hulls buried beneath the Baltic Sea. But every modern submarine, from the American Ohio class to the Russian Borei, still carries the ghost of the Type 21. It was the submarine that arrived too late to save an empire, but early enough to shape the future of war.